Hey there, everyone. Gregg Schutze here for ReadyForTheDraft.com, and this is the Ready for the Draft podcast, episode 37 of the 2020 podcast series, getting you ready for the NFL Draft. We're just a couple of days away, April 23rd through the 25th, all 7 rounds, held completely virtual. You know, when you have something that's just held completely virtually, everyone on VPN, you're going to have Zoom and Skype. Something's bound to go wrong, right? We're going to have some sort of technical difficulties during this draft. There's a lot of uncertainty. It's going to be a lot of fun, a lot of drama. So I can't wait for all of that to take place. So we left off last podcast looking at the first 4 rounds on the defensive side of the football, defensive ends, tackles, and both inside and outside linebackers. We're going to get through the 5th through 7th rounds, and then we're going to jump into the corners and the safeties. We got a lot of information to cover, so we're just going to go ahead and jump right into things because I want to make sure that we're covering anything and everything, try to get as many players together because, look, I want to make sure that you're getting ready for this draft, that you understand and you hear all the different names. As I talk about them, you'll be able to sit there and think, you know what? I remember Greg talking about this guy, and this is a guy to keep an eye on, even if it is on day 3 and this is an FCS prospect that people aren't really talking about. I want to make sure that I bring that to you. So let's go ahead and jump into the 5th round, and we're looking at linebackers first, and I'm looking at the Chargers, and the Chargers lost to Jatavis Brown, and I think that's one of the areas that the Chargers will end up looking. And in round number 6, I'm looking at Davion Taylor out of Colorado, and this is a guy who a bit of an undersized linebacker, I think converted safety, if you will. Guy who has a ton of range. And I think that's really what jumps off the screen. And this is a guy, he's a former track star, tremendous athlete. So when you look at him, he's 6 foot, 228 pounds, ran a 4.49 40, 35-inch vertical leap. I look at him, I look at the linebackers there. Nick Vigil is on the roster now. You have Denzel Perryman. I think they need to add some athleticism there to the linebacker position, and I think that's exactly what he can bring. I'm looking at Drew Tranquil as well, kind of one of those new age linebackers. And then at outside linebacker, you have Uchenna Nwosu and Melvin Ingram. And I think with Taylor, he could potentially be an outside backer, and he just provides depth both inside and outside. I really like that pick to the Chargers. And like I said, he reminds me a lot of Jatavis Brown with that athleticism. I'm looking at Miami in round number 5, and I think they need to get a nose tackle. When it's all said and done, I think Miami, they're not going to use all of their draft picks. I'd be surprised even if they use all 3 of their first round picks. But it remains to be seen exactly what they're going to pull off. But when you look at the nose tackle position, all you have is Devon Godshaw sitting there in the middle of that defense. And when I look at Miami, they need another guy in the middle to at least push for playing time. And I'm looking at Bravion Roy. If you haven't gotten to see this guy play, he was really a lot of fun to watch there for Matt Rule and company at Baylor. And with Roy, he and James Lynch really partnered up well, putting pressure on the quarterback. 6'1", 333 pounds. And this is a guy, look, 61 tackles from the nose tackle position, tremendously active, a guy who had really, really quick first step off the ball, a guy who can hold the point of attack. He's a true nose tackle. Look, 13 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks. He has that pass rush ability. And one of the things that I thought was interesting with Baylor, he had a lot of snaps where he was standing up. You don't see a nose tackle stand up very often. And this was a guy who just seemed to have a nonstop motor, was always working, and a guy who was on the field more often than not at the nose. The nose tackles, they're not always a guy that's going to, be tremendously active, just a space eater. He's not that guy. He's going to do more than just take up a lot of space. I really like Bravion Roy. I was surprised that he didn't make it to the combine. He's actually one of my favorite players to watch. You paired him, like I said, with James Lynch, and I think of Jalen Hurts going up against Baylor, and frankly, he just did not want to have to deal with these two guys because they were relentless coming after him. And I really like Bravion Roy. I think he's a guy that can end up being a starter in the league when it's all said and done. I really don't care what anybody else says about this guy. I think he has legit skills and a guy that I think belongs in the league and as a potential starter. I've moved some picks around, so I'm going to be getting that onto the website. So you'll want to be able to in the next day take a look at the website, take a look at readyforthedraft.com and see where I have everyone going. But in round number 5, I'm looking at Trevis Gibson out of Tulsa going to the Ravens. And what I've done with the Ravens draft to this point is, I had him taking Cesar Ruiz in round number 1, Jordan Brooks, the inside linebacker, in round 2, along with Robert Hunt. They get a defensive end in Raekwon Davis, Antonio Gandy Golden, get a big wide receiver, safety in Antoine Brooks, defensive end. I think they need more than one. They get Rashad Lawrence. They have another inside backer in Willie Gay. And then looking at Trevis Gibson, outside linebacker, a guy who has pass rush ability, and a guy who, he could potentially be a 4-3 defensive end. But I look at him, I'd like to play him in space. Watching him at the Senior Bowl, I thought he struggled at times getting off of blocks, coming off the edge. But look, 15 tackles for loss, 8 sacks, 13 total in his career, 8 forced fumbles, including 5 in 2018 as a junior. I really like this pick. I think he's a guy that can end up being a nice position player and a rotational player there for the Ravens. As we continue to move down the draft board, I'm looking at Tampa Bay. I think they need another defensive end. They did bring in Ndamukong Suh. They got him back. They've got William Golston. I'm looking at McTelvin out of Arkansas, 6'3", 309. I think he's going to end up being a pretty nice 5 technique. You're going to say, well, he's a pretty big dude. Ran a 4.9 840, still bench pressed 225, 27 times as well. He's pretty athletic, a guy who, at times, he really gave teams fits, even in the SEC. And you look at his numbers, 31 tackles for loss, 14 and a half sacks in his career, 6 forced fumbles, 4 pass breakups. This is a guy who is going to, I think he's going to thrive in the 5 technique. And I'm looking at Tampa Bay. That'd be a nice fit for him. So then we move on. Continuing down this draft board, we got to move fast and furious through these picks. Got a lot of guys to cover. I'm looking at Minnesota, and the Vikings, they need another defensive tackle. I think the Vikings absolutely do. When you look at them up front, they've got Shamar Stephen. I think they could potentially look for an upgrade there to play next to Michael Pierce, who's their nose tackle. And I'm looking at Robert Windsor out of Penn State. Some people have him coming off the board in either the 6th or 7th round, but the reason why I really like Windsor, he's tremendously athletic. He's 6'4", 290 pounds, ran a 4.9 40, a guy who has pretty good balance as well, a guy who's going to look to shoot gaps and really take advantage of his athleticism to make plays in the backfield. I think with Minnesota, this is a guy that could potentially compete with Steven for a starting spot when it's all said and done. Eagles, I think that at some point the Eagles are going to look for another defensive end as well. I mean, you do have Derek Barnett and you have Brandon Graham there at the defensive end position. Josh Sweat as well. You traded for Jannard Avery, who's either a linebacker, could potentially be a defensive end. Joe Ostman is a guy that also has some pass rush ability, but I think they end up, you can't have enough good pass rushers. And I think if Avery ends up playing linebacker, then Kenny Willekes is a guy that you could potentially be looking at. And what I like about Willekes, again, a guy who plays with constant effort, the 49 tackles for loss, 23 and a half sacks, a guy who just always seemed to be living in opposing backfields. He's not the most athletic guy, and I think that's one of the things that's going to cause his draft stock to really, really drop and pulls him into the 5th round. Ran a 4.8 740, nothing spectacular, but a guy who's just going to continuously work. I think he's a guy that's going to find his way out onto the field. It may not be in Philly, but I think he's going to end up finding a home there in the NFL. Jaguars, I talked previously about the fact that, hey, they lost Calais Campbell and they ultimately let him go. And you've got Yannick Ngakoue, and his future is really in question. So I'm looking at some point they need to get a defensive end. Jonathan Garvin out of Miami, 6'4", 263 pounds. Another guy who, I think he's a developing prospect, a guy who just continues to get better and better. I would have liked to have seen him come back to Miami for one more season, really, continue his development. As it stands, as a sophomore in 2018, 17 tackles for loss, Follows that up with another 9 in 2019, has 12 and a half sacks in his career as well. This is a kid I thought that he could have been, potentially a day two prospect had he come back for his senior season. There at Miami, as it stands, like I said, I think he's a guy that could potentially play his way into a rotational player and could potentially, he has that fringe starter potential, in my opinion. Ascending prospect, in my opinion, as well. Larrell Murchison, I think at some point you're going to see a defensive end go to Houston, and I like Murchison, a guy who isn't known for his explosiveness off the ball. He's 6'3", 297, tremendous balance though. And when you look at the ends, you've got J.J. Watt, you've got Charles Omenihu on the roster, Angelo Blackson, but I think they need to add another defensive end, and I think Murchison could end up being that guy. A guy who has some pass rush ability. Look, he went to NC State. And NC State's sent a lot of guys to the NFL recently along the defensive front. And I think Murchison's going to be the next guy in line. 20 tackles for loss and 11 sacks in 2 seasons there with the Wolfpack. Continuing to move through round number 5, I'm looking at Evan Weaver out of Cal, the tackling machine, going to the Patriots. This guy just feels like a Patriots pick. An intelligent player, guy who has a nose for the football, 6'2", 237 pounds, actually ran a faster 40 time at the combine than I would have expected out of Evan Weaver. Ran a 4.76, but this is a guy that you're not drafting him for his tremendous speed or explosiveness. You're drafting him for the instincts. You're drafting him for the nose for the football, and a guy who's just, again, a tackling machine. 181 tackles this past season. After, as a junior, he had 155 tackles, and 23 tackles for loss in his career, 8.5 sacks, 11 pass breakups. Dude went over 400 tackles. And really, when you look at that, what's impressive about the 407 tackles is he only came into 2018 with just 71 tackles in his career. So, I mean, when you talk about that, you're talking about a guy who was able to put up 336 tackles in 2 seasons. Unreal. I think the Patriots find a home for him, and he's one of those guys that you want to have on your roster because he just knows where the ball is going to be, and he's going to be able to make some plays. Continuing through, we get to the linebacker positions at the end of round number 5. I think KC needs another linebacker. Why not, right? But when you look at them, they've got Anthony Kitchens, they've got Damian Wilson, Dorian O'Daniel, Ben Neiman. I think they need to get another guy in there that's going to challenge for playing time. And I really like Michael Walker, out of Fresno State. Very long and lean dude, 6'3", 230 pounds. And with Walker, another guy who was, a really good athlete, tremendous range in just 2 seasons with the Bulldogs, 182 tackles, 22 and a half going for loss, 10 pass breakups. Offers a little bit of ability to rush the passer, but this is a guy who's going to play sideline to sideline. He's going to make plays behind the line of scrimmage, and he's going to drop into coverage. So he's a guy to me that I think actually could end up being drafted even higher. Ran a 4.65 40 at the combine. He's going to be a name to watch there on day number 3. And then Denver. I already mentioned that they were going to take an inside backer. I think they're actually going to go ahead and draft 2. And I'm looking at Shaq Quarterman out of Miami, 6 foot, 234 pounds. This guy, he started every game of his career at the U. It's crazy because it feels like he's been playing there for a decade. When you thought of the U on defense, you thought of, number 55, Shaq Quarterman, a guy who, had at least 82 tackles in each of his first 3 seasons. And then as a senior, really went off 107 tackles, 15 and a half going for loss, has 46 tackles for loss in his career, 12 sacks, including 5 as a junior, 13 pass breakups as well. So a guy who has shown that he can drop into coverage. I was worried that all he was going to be a downhill thumper type of a guy, but I thought that he did show, better skills dropping into coverage. I thought there was some definite tightness in his hips. He would get lost at times. I think he's definitely improved in that area. And look, when you're talking about Denver and you're talking about the linebacking core, especially along the interior of that line, the interior of that linebacking core, you've got Josie Jewell, you've got Alexander Johnson, you've got Todd Davis. To me, I think you need to continue to add football players and playmakers to that group, because I'm not sold on these guys, being that, being those starters and those impact players. I already have them taking Malik Harrison in round number 3. You get Shaq Quarterman. I think that really kind of balances things out in that linebacking core, especially when you have Bradley Chubb and Von Miller rushing the passer coming off the edge. So then we move on to round number 6. And looking at round 6, what's interesting here, this is another round that I've kind of been adjusting a little bit. And I'm looking at Benito Jones from Ole Miss, 6'1", 316 pounds. What I like about Benito Jones is this is a guy who I thought was pretty active. This is a guy who seemed to always get driven off the ball. There's a lot of bad tape there. Pad level, even though he is just 6'1", pad level at times would get him in trouble. That said, 31 tackles for loss and 10.5 sacks in his career. You could say, don't look at the stats. You're going to see a lot of plays, a lot of these trash plays. And that's true. And that's why he's going to be a 6th round pick. But he does offer up that ability. You really need to work on pad level. You need to work on, really his anchor more than anything else, so he's not getting driven back off the ball. But I'm looking at this, and Steve McClendon only has another year left on his deal there at nose tackle. You've got Folorunso Fatukasi behind McClendon, and Foley Fatukasi. Sure, he could potentially fill in that void, but I think you need to get another guy in there. And I really think that Benito Jones has a little bit of athleticism to him. 5'2", 640, not overly explosive, right? An 8.21, 3-cone drill, but I think he's got a little bit of that short area burst more than anything else. I think 6th rounds probably feels about right there for Benito. Moving on, we look at the Colts of 194, and I think here the Colts could end up looking for another pass rusher. And the reason being is the Colts, they've got Kimoko Toure to pair up with Justin Houston, Ben Banogu, Al-Qadim Muhammad there on the outside as well. I think this is an area where they could end up going with another defensive end and going DJ Wonnum. And DJ Wonnum, is a guy, ascending prospect in my opinion. People aren't really talking about him, but he's a big dude. He's 6'5", 258 pounds. I think plays around the line of scrimmage, 29.5 tackles for loss, 14 sacks. The last 2 seasons been hit with the injury bug, only played in 4 games in 2018, 11 in 2019. Needs to stay healthy and stay out on the field. I think that's really why, the production dropped off for him, was the battling all those injuries. Ran a 4.7 340, 34.5-inch vertical leap. I think this is a guy, 6th round range. I think Chris Ballard will be looking for a guy that's, he can nab here in the 6th or 7th round that can add to that pass rush group. Looking at, let's see, going on from there, the Colts, another defensive tackle. I have the Colts taking a defensive tackle earlier in the draft. And when I pull that up, let's see, where did he go? So I had them taking Devon Hamilton. I'm looking at them. I think they still need to get bigger up front. And I'm looking at Raekwon Williams, 6'4", 308, high cut dude, needs to work on his pad level, I think, more than anything else. When this guy plays with a low pad level, he can be incredibly dominant. I think he's got some stiffness in his hips, which, causes problems with his pad level. But look, he's pretty active. 157 tackles in his career, 29 tackles for loss, 11.5 sacks. This is a guy, he continued to make plays, for the Spartans, for Sparty, and a guy who I think a lot of people were expecting him to be one of the top defensive players as a junior. You saw some of the flashes in his freshman and sophomore season, so people were trying to predict here's going to be the breakout player. Didn't happen as a junior, and as a result, there was a lot of disappointment to his game. So I think he's been, he hasn't been that bad of a player, but I think what's happened is he hasn't lived up to some of the lofty expectations, and that's something that can definitely hurt him. Tyler Clark out of Georgia. I think I'm looking at the Patriots. I think they need another defensive end. They've got Lawrence Guy. They've got John Simon lining up at defensive end at times. And what I like about Tyler Clark, this is a guy that can be absolutely, he can be explosive. He can get up the ball, up the field, and can really wreak havoc on the quarterback. And, he's just not all that consistent. 6'4", 300 pounds, and he did such a rotation there at Georgia, and I think that's really one of the things that got him in. You can't look at the stats. Just 19 and a half tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, but you put on the game film and you saw number 52 making splash plays, getting into the backfield, affecting the quarterback, and really being disruptive. And I think that's one of the things for me when I look at him. When I look at Tyler Clark, he wasn't invited to the combine, and I think people look at some of the stats, and that's really where you worry about him at times. But I thought he was dominant at times against Texas A&M, and I think he's someone that can get up the field and be a nightmare behind the line of scrimmage. I thought he also had a nice game against Auburn, 2 tackles for loss in that game against the Tigers. They got a big win over the Tigers in that game. So I think this is a guy that, again, Bill Belichick looking for guys who can make plays, that can be versatile, and I think Tyler Clark can be that guy, especially in round number 6. Let's see. How about Kamal Martin? I think the Chicago Bears are looking for a linebacker. I really like Kamal Martin. I think he's a big, rangy linebacker, runs pretty well. Battled a little bit of injuries there in 2019, but is an effective playmaker. I look at the linebacking core. You've got Khalil Mack, you've got Danny Trevathan, you've got Roquan Smith, you've got Robert Quinn, kind of a murderer's row in terms of the playmakers there. Kiki Mingo behind them. Joel Igbinoghene is an inside linebacker, but I think there's, you've got some guys that, Josh Woods, James Vaughters, guys that, frankly need to be pushed. And I think you could potentially get an upgrade there at the linebacker position. And Kamal Martin, I think he is athletic. That's one of the things. He's not quite the same player that DeAndre Campbell was coming out of Minnesota, but 6'3", 240 pounds. A guy that has that range, the ability to play sideline to sideline. An intelligent player as well. Played in just 8 games in 2019, and I think that affected some of his, some of the stats, some of the production as well. 34-inch arms, so he's got the length to him as well. So I think this is probably about the right spot for him to come off the board. And look, the Bears have some depth there. I think Kamal Martin is a guy though that can get onto the roster and be a rotational guy as he continues to develop. As we move through Jaguars, I think at some point the Jaguars need to get another linebacker. They did draft Joe Schobert. They have Miles Jack. And, it's really going to be that other linebacker position. What are they going to do there? Who's going to be the guy filling in that hole? Leon Jacobs, is he going to be the strong side backer? Is Quincy Williams ultimately going to rotate over there? What's that going to look like? Dakota Allen is another guy that's on the roster that could potentially play that role. But I'm looking at Dele Harding out of Illinois. He was the inside linebacker there for the Fighting Illini. Another guy who was just a tackling machine. Wasn't invited to the combine and really wasn't all that heralded in the off-season games. But look, tremendously productive. 149 tackles this past season, 14 tackles for loss, and 3 interceptions at the linebacker position. And I think he's one of those guys that, he was the heartbeat of Lovie Smith's defense. And so when you talk about having a linebacker who's coached up by Lovie Smith, you know what you're getting. You're getting a smart, intelligent player. And the thing that I like about Harding is I think he has some of that versatility. I think he can play. He might be a weak side backer, which means that you may look at Miles Jack potentially moving to the strong side. It'll be interesting to see how things play out, but I think Harding would be a nice player. I had him going to the Patriots at one point because he does feel like a guy that could potentially be a Bill Belichick type player, but I think his athleticism is really going to play well there in Jacksonville. I think Green Bay needs to get another a pass rusher, an edge rusher, if you will, coming off the edge. You've got the Smith duo, with Zadarius Smith and Preston Smith. Beyond them, there's Rashawn Gary that's playing outside backer. Tim Williams was a guy that they brought in from Baltimore, but I think they need to get another pass rusher. And look, Olawale Batiku came to Illinois from USC. Battled some injuries and just didn't really see the field there for the Trojans. Shows up in Illinois and as a junior, 13 tackles for loss and 9 sacks. Most of those sacks were coming at the beginning of the season, really struggled in Big Ten play, which I think is why we didn't see him invited to the Combine. We didn't see him invited to the Senior Bowl or anything like that. But look, he's still a guy that knows how to get after the quarterback, a guy that needs to really play in space and coming off the edge. He struggles to get off blocks, but if you allow him to play in space, I think he's a guy that could potentially develop, especially behind Smith and Smith. Sounds like a law firm. 6'3", 249, Olawale Batiku going to Green Bay. I look at San Francisco. I look at that linebacking core, and the linebackers there. You're saying, well, that's not a need. Why would you end up? Why in your right mind would you be looking at a linebacker for the 49ers? They've got Quan Alexander, they've got Fred Warner, they've got Dre Greenlaw. If one of those guys gets hurt, then that's where you have those question marks. Joey Alfieri, Joe Walker, Aziz Al-Shire. I actually like Al-Shire. I think he's a guy who could end up making some plays there for the 49ers. But I look at Khalik Hudson, and I look at the safety position. I think he could potentially be a backup strong safety if you needed him to. He could be one of those guys that patrols around the line of scrimmage. Excellent range. He's not the biggest guy. 5'11", 224 pounds, showed up at the Combine and ran a 4.56 40, put up 225 30 times. So he's a big ball of muscle, but a guy who can be versatile. He can be a new age linebacker, could also drop back and play safety a little bit. He has that experience in his career. So I actually like the pick when it's all said and done. I mentioned the Jets in the last podcast that they were going to double up at the rush end position in round number 3. I actually have kind of moved things around. I actually have Josh Uche going to the Rams now in round number 3. And I'm looking at the Jets after they take Curtis Weaver. They look for another guard. I think Brian Winters isn't going to be the answer there forever. So I think Netane Mute actually ends up going to the Jets in round number 3. And so they need to find another pass rusher, in my opinion. Jordan Jenkins is the only other guy there. If they get Curtis Weaver at the top of round number 3, then a guy like Bryce Huff from Memphis would be a nice fit. Bryce Huff is a guy that can rush the passer coming off the edge there for Memphis. 6'3", 255 pounds. Has 18 and a half sacks in his career, 39 and a half tackles for loss, a guy that can play around, and behind the line of scrimmage, can get into opposing backfields and be disruptive. I think that's something that they're going to need there in New York for sure. They can't have enough of those guys. I think the Patriots, looking for another outside linebacker. I had them taking Zach Bond in round number 1. They go ahead and get another linebacker in round number 6. Carter Coughlin out of Minnesota, 6'3", 236 pounds, ran a 4.56 40 at the Combine. So more explosive straight ahead than I was expecting. The one thing with Coughlin, though, is he does have some stiffness to him. He does struggle to get off blocks at times. I think he does a decent job setting the edge. And when you look at the stats, 40 tackles for loss, including 26 and a half in 2017 and 2018. There was a drop off there his senior season. But look, he still ended up with 22 and a half tackles for loss. He has 8 forced fumbles. To his credit as well, 4 pass breakups in 2019 as well. He's a guy who's just a tireless worker, a guy who has a nonstop motor, and he's, again, just feels like a Bill Belichick type of guy, and a guy who's going to end up playing his way onto the field. If nothing else, he's making all those effort plays. Getting to round number 7, Michael Pinckney out of Miami. He was one of the trio of linebackers with Zach McLeod and Shaq Quarterman that came in and started right away there for the U. 5'11", 235 pounds, another veteran there at the position. I really like Michael Pinkney. I think he's got some decent athleticism. I look at him going to the Bengals in round number 7. The Bengals could use another linebacker. They did lose Nick Vigil, and so I think this is a guy that could potentially earn a roster spot. He's got that veteran presence to him, and a guy that I think can end up, like I said, making the roster when it's all said and done. I'm looking at Cam Gill. We're going to get into some of these FCS players, and Cam Gill out of Wagner, 6'3". He's a big dude. He's 6'3", 240 pounds, the outside linebacker, and a guy who he knows how to get after the quarterback. I think that's one of the things that is so surprising. And I think because of his pass rush ability, he could possibly end up coming off the board earlier on day 3. I don't think he's going to go any sooner than that. You saw him at times struggle, out in space, especially in the some of the oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank. Some of the postseason games, you saw him really kind of struggle when you actually asked him to drop into coverage and into space, and that's going to be his biggest issue, I think, more than anything else. But when you look at him, I'm having a hard time bringing up his stats right now because what's fun about him is he's just a playmaker, a guy who flies around to the football. Come on. None of these stats, the stat lines. Wagner's website is not wanting to give me any of my stats that I need. Why is this not working? So anyway, when I look at Cam Gill, I look at the Redskins, and we're talking about other linebackers. I think this is a guy who can come onto the roster and really solidify and round out that group. I'm looking at the team, and I'm looking at, really trying to figure out how we can round things out. This is a guy who knows how to get after the quarterback, a guy who can continue to develop. If you lose Ryan Kerrigan, then I think you're going to need that fourth linebacker, and I think Cam Gill can end up being that guy. Let's see, San Francisco, going to need another defensive tackle. I know that they've got Kinlaw on the roster already. I'm looking at Khalil Davis in round number 7 as another guy that you could potentially go after. And Khalil Davis has some pass rush ability. Ran a 4.75 40 at the combine, and also put up 225 32 times. So tremendously explosive and powerful player. It's just weird how Nebraska wasn't able to stop anybody up the middle running the football when you had the Davis twins and Darian Daniels in there. Can never really figure that out. Giants, they need to get pass rushers. And I'm looking at Michael Dana out of Michigan, 6'2", 261 pounds. He's big, he's physical, he wins at the point of attack. And a guy, when you talk about him, transferred from Central Michigan, and when you look at him, you're like, he didn't even really get onto the field there for Michigan, wasn't much of a playmaker. What really happened with him? And, when you think about it, he was playing behind guys like Aiden Hutchinson, who I think is going to be a stud there at Michigan. When you look at his game with the Chippewas, 27.5 tackles for loss, 15 sacks, including 8.5 as a junior, 3 fumble recoveries, a pass breakup. 2 of those fumble recoveries he actually took back for a touchdown. I think he's a guy that can be a potential depth player there for the Giants. Vikings, I'm looking at Bryce Stirk out of Montana State. And again, I mentioned that we were going to start getting into some of these FCS guys. But Bryce Stirk is a guy that I think plays with his hair on fire. I'm a big fan of his. I think he's a guy who's tremendously athletic and a guy who can play all over the field. Very disruptive. And when you look at his numbers in 2018, 17 tackles for loss, 8.5 sacks on the year, and a guy who in 2019, 65 tackles, including 20 for loss and 15 sacks. A guy who just, again, has a nose for the football, finished 6th in the FCS and 2nd in the Big Sky in sacks, and a guy who I think when you look at Minnesota, looking for those defensive ends. I had him taking one and earlier in the draft. And when I look at Bryce Stirk, I think he's another guy that can come in there. I think of Brian Robinson, and that's kind of what he reminds me of a little bit, is another Brian Robinson type. And if you compare him with Jabari Zuniga, you get there with Danielle Hunter. I think those are some guys that could really improve their pass rush. And Bryce Stirk, look, his production, he could potentially end up getting drafted earlier in the draft. Kendall Coleman, I have him going to the Carolina Panthers in the 7th round, 6'3", 257. A guy who, look, he and Alton Robinson had tremendous years in 2018. Production dropped off in 2019. Athletic guy, though. I think Carolina could end up getting some use out of him as a pass rusher. The Bears, I think the Bears also need to find a defensive end as a guy that's going to help put some pressure on the quarterback. And I'm going to give you another FCS prospect. And these are guys that I think, they may not get drafted when it's all said and done, but I wanted to make sure that I had them listed, I had them noted, and had them accounted for, because even if they don't get drafted, I think these are going to be guys that are going to be playing at the next level. Look, he's 6'3", 269 pounds, and a guy who just, is a guy that can make plays. He's really a lot of fun to watch. 27 tackles for loss in 2019 alone, and 12 sacks. Just makes plays behind the line of scrimmage. He's a big ball of energy, a big personality, and did a lot there for the Dukes at James Madison. So I think the Bears can end up really getting a guy late in the draft that can really put some pressure on the quarterback, knows how to get home. I'm looking at Justin Sternad. Redskins also needed inside backer, challenge Cole Holcomb. Justin Sternad, 6'3", 238 pounds. I thought he was a real versatile player there for Wake Forest. A guy who I thought could drop back into coverage. Very heady player. Had the leg injury. Played in only 7 games, but the year prior had 105 tackles, has 10 pass breakups in his career, 4 interceptions, including 3 as a sophomore. So he's a guy that can play behind the line of scrimmage. At the line of scrimmage, he can drop into coverage a little bit. Not the most athletic guy, ran in the 4.7s, but a guy who I think, he's an intelligent player, and I think he'd be a nice role player there. And continuing to move along, we're almost to the end of the draft here. The Bears need depth at that inside linebacker position. Looking at Joe Bocci, a guy who was really kind of the heart and soul there at Michigan State, had the PED issue, 6'1", 230 pounds. I think he's a better player in coverage dropping than a lot of people give him credit for. Green Bay, I think they need help at defensive end. And, Dean Lowry and Tyler Lancaster, I have them taking an end earlier in the draft. Actually have them taking Marlon Davidson in the 2nd round. And so I think you need to find another guy that's going to be able to rush the passer there in Green Bay. And I'm looking at Jonah Williams out of Weber State, 6'5", 275. And again, a guy who has double-digit sack potential there at the FCS level. That jump in production. The jump in talent going to the NFL. I think this is a guy who could potentially end up on a practice squad, but could ultimately end up developing into a guy that's going to make a roster. Tipa Nalai, I have him going to Houston. I think Houston needs to find a couple of playmakers coming off the edge, and I had him taking Darrell Taylor out of Tennessee earlier in the draft in the round number 3. And Nalai, look, he's got tremendous length. 29 tackles for loss, 19.5 sacks. Really his big year was the junior year under Matt Wells. 13 tackles for loss, 10 sacks, 64 tackles, tremendously productive. Saw a drop off in 2019. He was a transfer from TCU coming to the Aggies for his final 2 seasons. And, Nalai, again, 6'5", 235, that length. I think he's a guy that's going to at least get a look there in Houston. The Browns, I'm looking at James Smith Williams, 6'4", 265, really good athlete. I think this is a guy, round 7 makes some sense. He's another kid that played at NC State, not overly productive, but ran a 4.6 40, good athlete coming off the edge. he's a guy that you could potentially work with and develop. Um, I'm looking at Francis Bernard as another linebacker there for the Giants. Really a guy for Utah that was pretty versatile. Houston needs a nose tackle. DJ Reader not on the roster. John Pennicini, 6'1", 318 pounds. He's a guy that I think is athletic and a guy who can hold the point. And I mentioned Ferris State and Zach Seiler in the last podcast, 6'5", 275. Austin Edwards. I think Denver, they lost Derek Wolfe. They have Jarrell Casey coming onto the roster. They re-signed Shelby Harris. And so I think, Austin Edwards is a guy that could potentially make his way onto the roster. I think he's somebody like Zach Seiler. I think Seiler was a little bit more productive than Edwards, but I think they both have that ability. And then I'm looking at Casey Toohill going to Denver, get another pass rusher coming off the edge. Right at the end of the draft, 6'4", 250 pounds. Casey Toohill from Stanford, intelligent player, a guy who knows his role, does it well. Not overly flashy, but a guy who knows how to get after the quarterback. 14 sacks in his career, 21 and a half tackles for loss. So he knows how to get behind the line of scrimmage. Not the best athlete in the world, but just a smart, heady player. And I think that's something that the Broncos can get there at the linebacker position. So now we're going to go ahead and transition to our corners and our safeties. And we're going to go ahead and finish everything up and tie everything up in a bow here for all of our players. And then tomorrow's podcast, we're really going to be hammering home my final mock draft. So when we look at the corners and safeties, I think the guy that you have to be talking about is Jeffrey Okudah. I think Okudah, 6'1", 200 pounds, the junior. I think he's a better prospect than Denzel Ward, who came off the board number 4 overall to Cleveland. I've got him going number 3 to the Lions. Tremendous size for the position. I think a guy who's very patient at the line, stays square to the wide receiver despite the receiver's initial movements off the line, which forces the wide receiver to commit before he turns and runs. Can get very physical with the receiver, getting his hands on his man to jam him and reroute him at the line. Also does a tremendous job using the boundary as another defender, pinning his man against the sideline, eliminating any separation, really sticks like glue to the wideout with his physical blanket coverage. Also does a good job in bail technique, getting on top of the wide receiver on vertical routes, looking back for the ball, look and lean, getting in towards the wide receiver to close the distance, hugs the ball side hip of the receiver, allowing him to extend those long arms and make a play on the ball. I think he's a day one starter. He's going to end up replacing Darius Slay, and I think he has Pro Bowl potential when it's all said and done. So corners, what's interesting with this draft is I think there are going to be 4 corners that could potentially be drafted in round number 1. I'm looking at number 2, and San Francisco sitting there at number 13. There's a good chance that Henry Ruggs comes off the board as number 1 wideout. I think Denver has a chance to trade up. A number of teams are really interested in his services. They've got to get ahead of the Jets, the Raiders, and the 49ers in order to do that, because all those teams are going to be looking for a wideout. I think ultimately they all end up coming off the board before San Francisco picks at number 13, which means they have to look somewhere else. And I think CJ Henderson solidified himself as a number 2 corner in this draft, ran a 4.39 40 at the combine. Look, this guy, Pro Football Focus noted in 2018, he allowed just 1 reception on every 19 snaps and didn't allow a single touchdown in coverage. As a junior, had 11 pass breakups despite only playing in nine games, battling an ankle injury. The cover skills, his ability to just mirror the receiver, puts himself in a tremendous position to make a play on the football. I like him to the 49ers there at number 13 overall. I think Atlanta is another team that's really interested in him. There's a number of places that he can end up going, but I think that really makes a lot of sense for him right now. Vegas. What's going to be interesting is I think there's a pipeline there between the Raiders with Gruden and Mike Mayock and the Clemson Tigers. We saw that with 3 players that all played well last season, all starters at some point during the year, with Cleveland Ferrell, Trayvon Mullen, and yes, even Hunter Renfrow. I believe he started a couple of games, playing there out of the slot. So I think corner is going to be a guy, a position that they're going to look for possibly in round number 1. And at 19, I'm looking at AJ Terrell, 6'1", 195 pounds. Yes, the last game that we saw, he was struggling mightily against LSU. Jamar Chase really ate him up. And look, one game doesn't really make or break a career, or a career. And this was really a career where he had more ups than downs. That one game can't define that career. This is a guy who, if you watched him in the last 3 games, Virginia in the ACC championship game, this was a guy who did a great job playing inside leverage, repeatedly turning and running with the receiver, pinning his man to the sideline, not allowing separation, taking away options for Bryce Perkins. In the Fiesta Bowl against Ohio State, showed the ability to jump routes on the perimeter, disruptive at the catch point, physical press corner as well, jamming his man off the line of scrimmage. So the games leading up to that national title game, I thought he played really well. And this is a guy, again, 3 seasons, one game, you really can't fault him for it too much. He's got tremendous length. Are there other better corners that are out there? Possibly. But, when I look at it, I think there is something to the fact that Oakland is looking at guys from Clemson, and this guy could potentially pair up with Trayvon Mullen, and I think that really make things interesting there in Vegas. So as we continue to move along, I think Minnesota at 25, looking for a safety. And you're going to say, well, why are they looking for a safety? I thought they signed the free safety Anthony Harris. Well, Cleveland.com's Mary Kay Cabot, reported that a trade is on the table for Anthony Harris. So if that's the case, you're talking about potentially getting rid of Harris. Then I'm looking at Antoine Winfield Jr., my top safety on the in the draft. I think he'd be a logical replacement. Remember his dad, Antoine Winfield Sr., 9 seasons in the purple and gold, racked up 3 Pro Bowl selections in the process. Ball hawk, Junior is a ball hawk, ability to play up on the line one play, then in the slot the next, before playing over the top as a deep safety after that. Swiss Army knife of the secondary. Biggest concern was his long speed, but he ran a 4.45 at the combine. You can really eliminate that first hurdle that would keep him from round number 1. Started his career with the Gophers in 2016, finished with 52 tackles, 3 pass breakups, 2 fumble recoveries, one of which was returned for a touchdown. But hamstring and foot injuries sidelined him for the next 2 seasons, so durability has to be a concern. Returns to action in a big way in 2019, though. 83 tackles, 3 sacks to go along with 7 interceptions, 2 forced fumbles, and a touchdown. Unanimous first team All-America honors, first team All-Big Ten, Big Ten Defensive Back of the Year, playmaker in the box, diagnoses plays quickly, takes excellent angles to the football, very reliable tackler in the open field, a savvy blitzer, delaying his blitz, which allows him to get a jump on blockers. Tremendous job with route recognition as a deep safety, read the quarterback's eyes, allowing him to get a good jump on the football. Angles over the top allow him to undercut routes and make plays on the ball as well. Some teams worry about him being able to cover receivers in the slot, but I think the long speed, he shows that he can be effective, has tremendous ball skills, timing his jump to attack the ball at the catch point. What's crazy, he does lack ideal size. He is 5'9", 203. The other thing too is he doesn't have many pass breakups, so it's kind of an all or nothing thing. Either he's picking the ball off or he's not, really making a play on the football at all. But I think, his ability to haul in those interceptions really sets him apart as one of those guys you have to keep an eye out for. Even with Trevon Diggs on the board, I think Kansas City is actually going to go Jeff Gladney, the 5'10", 191-pound ball hawk there for the TCU Horned Frogs, a guy who has 5 interceptions, 37 pass breakups in his career, leaping ability to challenge receivers with those 50-50 balls, times his jump well to get a hand in to make a play on the ball. And, he doesn't have that ideal size to be an outside corner, but his aggressiveness, is something that can be taken advantage of by the quarterbacks, resulting in getting beaten on double moves over the top. But, he's someone who has the ball skills, puts himself in a position to make a play, trusts his eyes in zone coverage, reads the play unfold in front of him, breaks quickly on the football, shows good footwork and bail technique to plan as the receiver comes back to the football, drives downhill without any wasted movement to put him in position to make a play on the ball. And he also is a guy that's going to look to jam his receiver and reroute at the line of scrimmage, has the agility and the route anticipation to stay on the hip of the receiver. I like Gladney. I think ultimately you lost Kendall Fuller. This is a guy that I think can come in and replace Kendall Fuller, similar size. And I think this is a guy that can end up making some of those plays and, seems like a pretty good fit there. You notice I only mentioned one safety. We're going to get to more safeties as we get through this. But yes, the safety position, there's a chance that Xavier McKinney could potentially be a first round pick. I don't think Grant Delpit is a first rounder at this point, but he will be taken in round 2. So you're looking at the next defensive back off the board. I'm looking at 38 Carolina Panthers. I think they need to replace James Bradbury at the cornerback position. I'm looking at Noah Igbinoghene, and Igbinoghene has the explosive speed. This is a guy who's a kick returner extraordinaire, a guy who makes plays in the return game, 2 returns, 4 touchdown. A guy who also has 18 pass breakups in his career, just the 1 interception. So there is a little bit of concern. Can he make the big plays when he needs to? But he shows up at the combine and able to show off some of his athleticism. Ran a 4.48 40, 37-inch vertical leap. I think round 1 is a little rich for him, in my opinion. I think he comes off the board in round 2, and Carolina gets a starting corner. Dolphins ultimately end up getting Xavier McKinney. And look, McKinney, again, I think he absolutely has the ability to be a first-round pick. I just don't know, in terms of some of the athleticism. I think maybe the 40 time might have scared some people off a little bit. When you look at what McKinney does, he makes plays all over the field, but ran that 4.63 40. So there is some concern there. 6 foot, 201 pounds. McKinney does, look, 175 tackles, 13 tackles for loss, 6 sacks, 5 interceptions, 15 pass breakups, 6 forced fumbles. Guy has a nose for the football. He was one of the lead, he was really the leader of that secondary, and a guy, again, I think the Dolphins could potentially take him in round number 1. I think the Patriots could potentially take him in round number 1. Shoot, Dallas could take him in round number 1 because Clinton Dix is only a 1-year rental. But I think if Miami stays true to things, they could end up getting him in round number 2. And if they do, that could potentially be a steal. Same goes for Kristian Fulton. 6'1", 200 pounds, the junior out of LSU. I've had him in the first round of my drafts, but I think he goes to the Jaguars ultimately, but I have him going in round 2. I think those off-field issues, ultimately, he was initially suspended for 2 seasons, falsifying a drug sample for a PED test, and ultimately was able to get his way back onto the field. And in 2018, 2019, showed off, his ability to make plays. You just worry about his off-field issues. Has he learned from those? But 20 pass breakups in the last 2 seasons, 2 interceptions, a guy who didn't really see the football thrown his way, even though he had Greedy Williams playing next to him. In 2018, I think Kristian Fulton can end up being a star and could potentially be that guy that could challenge to potentially replace Jalen Ramsey. It's hard to really replace a guy, a Pro Bowl, all-pro like Jalen Ramsey, but I think Fulton has some of that upside to be able to do that. Denver, I think they need to find another corner to replace Chris Harris Jr., and if they don't end up getting CJ Henderson in round number 1, I think Trevon Diggs could potentially be had in round 2. He's another guy that I've flirted with in the first round. 6'1", 205, converted wide receiver, pretty good length to him. A guy who has, really excellent route recognition. As a former wideout, I think he definitely displays that. 17 pass breakups, 4 interceptions, a guy who just continues to develop, was a receiver when he first showed up at Alabama, played the last 3 seasons as a corner. And I look at Justin Lane. He went to Pittsburgh in round number 3. I don't think we're going to have Diggs fall that far. I think he's going to come off the board in round 2. That makes a lot of sense for me. I'm looking at Atlanta. I think Atlanta needs a corner as well. We've talked about that previously, with Desmond Trufant moving on. And I'm looking at Jalen Johnson. Look, 6 foot, 193 pounds, the junior out of Utah, another guy who has tremendous length. Don't put on the game against USC if you're wanting to really study him. the plus side because I thought he got burned, and Michael Pittman Jr. really beat this guy up. But look, 21 pass breakups, 7 interceptions in his career. The junior for the Utes was really the leader of that secondary, in my opinion. And that was a secondary that has a bunch of guys that are going to get drafted in this year's draft. But when I look at Atlanta, you've got Isaiah Oliver. You've got then after that, Kendall Sheffield, Bleedy Ray Wilson is the veteran of the group. Jordan Miller suspended for the first 4 games. I think you need to get another cornerback into that group, and this just feels like a pretty good pick for me. They get some size there at the cornerback position. Jeremy Chinn, if you haven't seen him play from Southern Illinois, I think Dallas needs to get that corner. I mean that safety. Play alongside Xavier Woods and Jeremy Chinn, 6'3", 221 pounds, a guy who's tremendously athletic, showed up at the combine, ran a 4.45 40, 41-inch vertical leap. And you look at the size and you're like, man, is this guy a linebacker? But the production at the safety position was absolutely unreal. And that's why I don't think he gets out of round 2. There's no way. 243 tackles in his career. 13 interceptions, had 3 interceptions in each of his first 3 seasons, and then another 4 in 2019, 31 pass breakups, 6 forced fumbles. Guy just has a nose for the football. Big physical player as well. He's making a jump in competition, so that's going to be a huge concern when it's all said and done. But I think this is a guy that could end up, really making some plays there and really making some noise for Dallas in their secondary. As we continue to move on, Damon Arnett, another corner. I think Minnesota needs to find a cornerback desperately, and they could potentially use one of their picks in round number 1 to get a cornerback. I'm looking at Damon Arnett, 6 foot, 195, physical corner. Flirted with coming out after his junior year. Glad he came back, really redeemed himself because I thought his junior season was kind of subpar for him. But with Minnesota, they lost Xavier Rhodes, they lost Trey Waynes, and they lost Mackenzie Alexander. They need to get cornerbacks in a serious way, and I think this is a pick for them that they need to make. And you could potentially, this is a pick or a position that I think Minnesota ultimately ends up doubling up on when it's all said and done. You've got Mike Hughes. After that, there's really not a whole lot at the position, so I think this is a must. I'm looking at Grant Delpit going to Seattle. 6'2", 213 pounds. Look, he was the Jim Thorpe Award winner, but I think a lot of that was on reputation. Really what his playmaking ability as a sophomore was really what got him on the map. I think, Bradley McDougald is playing the strong safety position alongside Quandre Diggs. I think Grant Delpit would be an upgrade when it's all said and done. Delpit, yes, he missed some tackles, but he also was battling an ankle injury. When he's healthy, this guy is a dynamic playmaker. Look, 24 pass breakups, 8 interceptions in his career. He had 5 in 2018 to go along with 9 pass breakups, had 74 tackles, 9.5 tackles for loss, 5 sacks. Production dropped again because of that ankle injury and, struggled with his range. You saw a guy who would get out of position and ultimately end up lunging at guys and just completely whiff on some tackles. But I think when he's completely healthy, I think he returns to that 2018 form. I really do. I think he'd be a steal in round number 2. I think Seattle ends up getting him there. Titans sitting at number 61. I think they need a corner as well. They did sign Ty Smith to go along with. They only have 4 corners on the roster, but you have Adoree Jackson and you have Malcolm Butler. And I think you need to get another corner out there, allow Butler to move into the slot. Bryce Hall makes a ton of sense. 6'1", 200 pounds, had a leg injury as a senior, but look, as a sophomore, as a junior, 21 pass breakups. Had he come out as a junior, he probably would have been the number 1 corner taken in the draft. So that's all I have there in round number 2. Staying on day 2, moving to round number 3 now. Cam Dantzler. I think the Dolphins need another corner. You already have Xavier Howard. You have Bryce Jones. Get a third corner there. Cam Dantzler has tremendous length. 6'2", 187 pounds. Has 5 interceptions. And I want to say, off the top of my head, see if I can get this right. I want to say that he has 18 pass breakups in his career. Let's see if I can get that right. I don't have his stats in front of me as I scroll through this. 5 interceptions and 20 pass breakups, so it's a little off. 17, though, in the past 2 seasons. And look, Terrell Buckley is his position coach. He's come out and said he's the number 1 corner in the draft. T-Buck played a lot of years in the league, so he understands what it takes to be successful at the next level. I think he could potentially be a steal. Look, the 40 time in the 4.6s is cause for concern, but I think at the end of the day, he's going to be a nice pickup. Ashton Davis, Jaguars, they have Jared Wilson. I think Ashton Davis, 6'1", 202, a track guy, still learning the position, but a guy who has tremendous range, makes some plays on the football. And look, Ashton, everyone was kind of hyping him up as a senior because when you looked at him, 4 interceptions in 2018 and 5 pass breakups, really, getting a better feel for the position when another 2 interceptions in 2019, 4 pass breakups, did play in just 11 games, got bit with the injury bug a little bit, but I think he's a tremendous athlete. I think the Jags, if nothing else, they get another player that's going to challenge Jared Wilson there for the starting spot. Cleveland, I think with Cleveland, they lost Demarius Randall there at the safety position, and they brought in some guys. I think that's one thing that you can absolutely say. They brought in some safeties. They have Carl Joseph at the strong safety. Anderson Dejo right now is their free safety. There's Sheldrick Redwine on the roster right now, the rookie. But I think when it's all said and done, when I'm looking at this team at the safety position, I think Kyle Dugger is going to be a guy that's going to end up eventually being that free safety for the Cleveland Browns. And I look at Kyle and what he's able to do. Another guy, look, he played at Lenoir-Rhyne. So in terms of the jump in competition, another guy that we're really talking about. But look, 6'2", 220 pounds, a monster there at the safety position, 237 tackles, excellent range, has the ball skills as well, 10 interceptions, 36 pass breakups, 6 fumble recoveries, to go along with 6 forced fumbles, has returned 6 punt returns for touchdown as well. So he's dynamic in the return game. So I think when you look at Cleveland and you look at their return game, you have Jarvis Landry as your punt returner. This could be the guy that can ultimately take over for Landry. You really don't want one of your starting wideouts back there returning punts if you don't have to. And I think that'd be a nice guy that you could slide in there, and be effective in the return game. Continuing to go through, I think Dallas needs a big corner. They have a lot of smaller guys on the roster. I'm looking at 6'1", 200-pound Michael Ojemudia out of Iowa, one of the few guys that was able to actually reroute the huge mammoth receiver that is Chase Claypool. But look, Ojemudia, guy that people weren't really talking about, but I'm glad ultimately to be introduced to him by Jim Nagy. I've watched him play at Iowa. I thought he flashed, but I don't know why he didn't really register for me. After getting to watch him at the Senior Bowl, I went back and watched some of the tape, and it started clicking. 6 interceptions, 17 pass breakups in his career, has tremendous length, showed up at the combine, and again, a guy that people weren't really talking about, ran a 4.45 40, 6.87 3-cone drill, is the fastest among all the corners as well. Actually, it wasn't. I take that back. Miles Bryant, but he was number 2 to Miles Bryant, the diminutive 5'8", 5'9", DB there at Washington, but a guy who I think is an ascending prospect. I had him going to the Raiders. If the Raiders look for another corner on day 2, I think this could end up being the guy. I know Mike Mayock likes to have corners with some length, and Ojemudia could be a potential guy that could end up with the Raiders as well. Continuing through, let's see what else we have. I've got Terrell Burgess for Utah, safety going to Denver. Denver Broncos need some depth there at the safety position. They have Justin Simmons, who they slapped the franchise tag on, so he's going to be back for at least one more season. And you've got Kareem Jackson, the aging Kareem Jackson at strong safety, so you need to have guys that can fill in later on, and I think Terrell Burgess could potentially be that guy for them. And Amik Robertson, I think the Eagles, this just feels like a match in round three. 5'8", 187, the junior, a guy that people really aren't talking about. And it's really because he went to Louisiana Tech. But this dude is an absolute playmaker, a ball hawk, a guy who's going to be, the nickel guy who can line up in the slot and just take over. 14 interceptions, never had less than four in a season, 34 pass breakups. Look, also 23 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, 184 tackles. Why is this guy not being talked about in round one? I'm not sorry, not round one, but round two. It's because he's short. It's that lack of size. If he had a few more inches to him, then we could be talking about a potential first round prospect. That said, I think Amik Robertson is a guy that you really have to keep an eye out for. 5'8", 187. But again, the ball skills are evident, and a guy who I think can make plays for days. So that's the end of round three and day two in the books. Moving on to day three. I think there's a lot of talent to be had on day three as well. Darnay Holmes out of UCLA, 5'10", 195. Another junior who decided to come out. I think a lot of people like his cover skills. I wasn't as impressed with Darnay Holmes. I thought, there were games in the Pac-12 where he struggled. He did have 17 pass breakups, 8 interceptions in his career. I think, his ability to make a play on the football, is there. But I thought there were a lot of bad tape as well going up against some of the better wide receivers in the draft. Ran a 4.48 40, 5'10", 195. Can he play outside? Is he going to be more of a slot corner? I think that's ultimately why he ends up falling to day three, because you're kind of questionable exactly where you're going to play him at the cornerback position. Continuing to move through, Ravens, Chuck Clark is their strong safety. I think they can potentially upgrade there. Antoine Brooks Jr., 5'11", 220-pound strong safety there out of Maryland. Played alongside Darnell Savage, the Green Bay Packer first-round pick from a season ago. And Antoine Brooks is a guy who I think, again, very physical, plays around the line of scrimmage, could potentially be another linebacker in the box. 237 tackles, including 87 this past season. 27 and a half tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks, 4 interceptions, 9 pass breakups. A guy, to me, he likes to play downhill whenever possible, and having that physicality there at the back end of the Ravens defense, that's something that I think the Ravens are kind of lacking right now. I think he'd be a nice addition there in round number 4. Continuing to move through, J.R. Reed out of Georgia. J.R. Reed, really a leader of that secondary, a guy that people haven't really given enough credit for the work that he's done back there on the back end of that defense. 199 tackles, a guy who plays over the top pretty well, comes down into the box when he needs to. But look, 5 interceptions, 14 pass breakups, really the leader of that Bulldog defense, as I said. And a guy, for me, I just think he's a guy that is going to be a consistent player. May not be a star in the league, but I think he's going to be consistent, be a solid player. 6'1", 202, ran a 4.54 40 at the combine, 34-inch vertical leap. He's got decent hips as well. I'm looking at the Bears. They already have Eddie Jackson, and they brought in Deion Bush, but I think J.R. Reed can push Deion Bush for playing time. Julian Blackmon, out of Utah, another of the Utah Utes, the trio of guys that I really think are going to get drafted in the first 4 rounds of this draft, which is quite remarkable when you look at that secondary. But when you look at the safety positions, you have Jalen Mills, who could potentially end up moving over to the corner position. You've got Rodney McLeod. I think this is a guy that can step in and can challenge for a starting spot there on the roster early on. 6 foot, 187, Julian Blackmon out of Utah. Round number 5, starts off Detroit Lions. I'm looking at Brandon Jones out of Texas, 5'11", 198 pounds, a guy who wants to be big and physical. I think, he's not as reliable as a tackler. He wants to go in and throw his weight around, needs to do a better job wrapping up, but he was the veteran leader of that Texas defense. And yes, they have Deron Harmon, but then you have Tracy Walker, free safety. You have Jaron Curse. I think, Miles Killebrew. I think this is going to be a guy that can come in there and challenge this group for a roster spot and could potentially end up looking at that group of free safeties. He could probably end up moving his way into potentially starting there when it's all said and done. I think he has some ability there. Vildor, I think he goes to the Giants. Giants continue to need cornerback help. I think this is a guy that can play in the slot, 5'10", 191 pounds. And when you look at the Giants, they do have DeAndre Baker. He struggled at times. You do have James Bradbury on the roster who you brought in. You have Corey Ballantyne and Sam Beal. But if you're looking for a guy who's going to just be more of a slot player, then I think Vildor is going to be that guy. And what I really like about Vildor are the ball skills. I think that's one of the things that you'd absolutely see. 25 pass breakups, 9 interceptions, and a guy who, look, he's really athletic, and pretty quick. If you saw him at the combine and watched him perform, ran a 4.44 40, 39.5-inch vertical leap, also put up 225 22 times, one of the stronger corners in the draft. So I think he's somebody to definitely keep an eye on. Let's see. Isang Bassi out of Wake Forest, 5'9", 191. He feels like a guy that could potentially go to the Raiders, be a guy that could potentially be a challenge in the slot or as a nickel. 4.46 40, 39.5-inch vertical leap, 6.95 3-cone drill. So one of the more explosive guys there at the draft. I thought he absolutely helped himself. I think he was somebody that people were talking about possibly falling potentially even out of the draft or possibly being a 6th or 7th round pick. 45 pass breakups in his career, double-digit pass breakups in each of the last 3 seasons, 227 tackles, 12.5 for loss. A guy who wants to come up and hit you and wrap up. 3 straight seasons with at least 60 tackles. You don't see a lot of corners with that type of production. 5 interceptions as well, one of which he returned for a touchdown. That was his sophomore season. I'm a big fan of Isang Bassi. They're out of Wake Forest, and a guy who I think is going to get a lot of playing time, and I think the Raiders would be a nice fit for him. Let's see. Continuing through round number 5, Lavert Hill out of Michigan, 5'10", 190. The biggest issue that I have with him, much like I had with David Long a season ago, he's really handsy. That's one of the things that he doesn't really trust himself. He wants to grab receivers when he gets beat and doesn't really trust himself and get himself into position. I thought he got overpowered, especially by Denzel Mims at the Senior Bowl. But look, 6 interceptions, 20 pass breakups in his career. He does have the ball skills, and I think round 5, round 6 range makes some sense for me. The Dolphins, I think they're going to end up. I mentioned that they already were going to need one other corner. And, so that's why I had him taking Cam Dantzler in round number 3. I think you get one more corner on the roster. Look, Miami may not end up using all of their picks, but if they do, you can get 2 quality corners there. And, Lavert Hill there at the end of round 5, that's probably the top end of where he's going to go in this draft. Round 6, I'm looking at the Bills, and they've got Matt Milano at linebacker, and then the safety position. You'll see where I'm going here in a second. But then, you also look at safety, and you have Micah Hyde, you have Jordan Poyer. A guy that I'm really looking at that can potentially fill a couple of spots on this team is Tanner Muse. Now, what I really like about Tanner Muse is, he's an intelligent player, very smart, puts himself into position to make plays, a very physical player. And look, he ran in the 4.4s at the combine. I thought that was a big surprise. 4.4 140, 6'2", 227 pounds. He's a straight line guy. I think there's stiffness in his hips, and you saw him repeatedly get burned and get out of position. And that's one of the things that really worries me about him is, he's somebody that, I thought CeeDee Lamb took advantage of that. I thought LSU really took advantage of it as well. A guy that couldn't really break down, and, he can get turned around trying to drop into coverage. He struggled with that as well. So I think he's somebody that could potentially end up playing the linebacker position. But, I think round 6 ultimately ends up making the most sense. I think the fact that he ran that 4.41 could potentially get him drafted earlier. I worry about the stiffness in those hips, especially if they're going to be asking him to cover His angles. I think he also ends up getting himself in trouble a little bit with some of the angles that he takes. Reggie Robinson, the second. People aren't really talking about him. He's 6'1" and 205 pounds out of Tulsa. And that's a big reason why I don't think people are really talking about him is, he's playing there at Tulsa in the American Athletic Conference. But look, ball skills, 13 this past season, had 3 interceptions as well, 34 in his career, has pretty good size, again, 6'1", 205. And, a guy who ultimately was covering the team's top receiver for much of the game, ran a 4.44 40. And so a guy with his size could potentially come off the board earlier, round 4, round 5. If he falls all the way to round 6, the Jags, I mentioned that they are in need of some corners, and I think they take Kristian Fulton in round number 2, and I think getting another cornerback with some size is going to definitely help for them on the outside, especially when you're talking about Rashawn Melvin, DJ Hayden, Perry Nickerson, Trey Herndon. None of them are under contract beyond 2020. So I think this is kind of an investment in the future. And, one of those guys may not even be on the roster beyond draft day. Or I'm sorry, after camp. I think the Packers need another corner. I'm looking at Grayland Arnold out of Baylor, 5'9", 186. Junior, I thought he should have come back for one more year. Round 6 feels about right. This is a guy who could potentially end up in Carolina just because of that Matt Rule connection. A guy who, the 6 interceptions this past season, I think that's really what put him on the map. A guy who I think is going to probably play in the nickel when it's all said and done. Geno Stone, 5'10", 207, the junior. Another guy that came out, I was kind of surprised that he did. Some people are talking him up a lot more. I think he does have some range. I think he's a physical, big hitter. I'm looking at the Steelers, and they have Mika Fitzpatrick. They have Terrell Edmonds. I think this is a guy that's going to be able to provide some depth there to the position as potentially a third safety. And look, Geno, in terms of the production, had 70 tackles this past season, 4 pass breakups, and interception. A guy that was making plays all over the field, had 3 forced fumbles as well. Decent nose for the football, pretty good instincts. He's one of those guys. I think there are other safeties that outperformed him. Arizona, I think, looking for another safety, bigger safety, Miles Dorn, North Carolina, 6'1", 205. He and Dominique Ross were my 2 favorite players to watch there at Carolina. I think he gets a shot there. The Patriots, I'm looking at Kenny Robinson out of West Virginia, 6'2", 200, ends up showing up for St. Louis, the Battlehawks. And, that's the thing that, he opted to not to enter the draft. Well, actually, I take that back. He was a sophomore. Ultimately, ended up not coming back for his junior season, and then ultimately was going to work out, and wait for the draft. Ends up getting drafted by the XFL. Had 7 interceptions in his career for the Mountaineers, 2 of which that he returned for touchdowns. 7 pass breakups. Pretty active there at the safety position as well. Tremendous ball skills. And I'm trying to see if I can find his numbers there with the XFL. Okay, so I was able to find it. 2 interceptions. So he was productive there for the St. Louis Battlehawks as well. And I think there's no denying that pro experience is definitely going to help. And this is a guy, look, I don't think he's going to be a first rounder. He could potentially come off the board much earlier. He's one of those intriguing prospects, a guy who I think could end up coming off the board as early as round 2, possibly round 3. I could see Seattle. I mentioned them taking Grant Delpit. If they don't want to go Delpit, this could potentially be the guy that they end up looking for. And I think that might not be a bad go for them when it's all said and done. I think that's going to be one of those interesting draft picks. Dane Jackson out of Pittsburgh, 6 foot, 187 pounds. A guy who I think is one of those bigger corners, and a guy who I thought showed off a ton of ball skills for the Panthers during his career. A guy who had double-digit sacks or double-digit pass breakups. 4.57 40 at the combine. 35-inch vertical leap, showed off, decent hips, I thought there as well. And, when you're talking Dane Jackson, you're talking, if I can get my computer pulled up here, when you look at Dane, he wound up with, let's see, 4 interceptions, 39 pass breakups, including 26 in the past 2 seasons, 4 forced fumbles as well. I think he's one of those guys who's going to be a sneaky good player. And I mentioned the Vikings needing to get corners, and I think they get 2 here on day 2, and I think they'd really be getting some productive players there, getting a lot out of them. L'Jarius Sneed from Louisiana Tech. I think Green Bay potentially looking for another corner. They already have one in Savage, Darnell Savage, who absolutely I think is a playmaker. He's a keeper, a guy that some people were surprised he was drafted in round number 1. Absolutely a keeper. You've got Adrian Amos, the free safety. I think you need some depth there at the position. And L'Jarius Sneed, the reason why I like him, again, another guy with the ball skills, and that's something that was definitely evident there. 6'1", and 190 pounds, and 8 interceptions in his career, back-to-back seasons with 3 interceptions, 19 pass breakups as well. A guy who started off his career, he played corner, moved to safety for a senior season, and a guy who I think could end up playing his way onto the field when it's all said and done. Amos, this guy could potentially be a replacement for Adrian Amos when it's all said and done there in Green Bay. So we get to the end of round number 6. Harrison Hand going to the Patriots. Chris Williamson going to Seattle. Harrison Hand, a guy who transferred in, shows up at Temple, and 1 season of action there. I thought that he definitely had potential. A guy who I thought really showed off some pretty good ball skills. Started his career at Baylor and transfers to Temple this past season. A guy who moved to Temple, and you look at his numbers, 16 total pass breakups, 4 interceptions in his career. A guy who I really would have been interested to see what he could do for the Owls. But I think round 6, some people think that he might be a 4th or 5th rounder. There wasn't enough for me to really see on the field that really, says, yes, this guy has to actually be on my roster if I'm in NFL executive. Chris Williamson, I mentioned him out of Minnesota, the last 2 seasons playing there for the Golden Gophers, and another guy who I think has decent ball skills. I think he's an ascending prospect. Just 1 interception this past season, but it was for 43. Returned it back 43 yards for a touchdown. He's one of those guys down the stretch for the Golden Gophers. That magical year there for PJ Fleck, a guy who I think was really counted upon and relied upon there down at the end of the season. In round number 7, I mentioned, let's see, with Arizona, they already take 1 corner. I think they end up getting another one. I'm looking at Neville Clark out of UCF. Has pretty good length for him, decent athleticism as well. I think it's kind of underrated athleticism. A guy that people aren't really talking about. 6'1", 190. A guy who can play a little bit on the outside. Has pretty good ball skills. 6'8", 3-cone drill. So a guy, that has the ability to sink his hips and drop and in and out of his cuts for a guy his height. 29 pass breakups, including 24 the past 2 seasons, 5 interceptions in his career. I think he's a guy that can be had in the last couple of rounds of the draft. And I think Arizona, getting a couple of corners, I think this would be a nice pick for them. As we continue to move, Parnell Motley there for OU, 6', 178. This is a guy, people really gave him a hard time because of his vertical leap that was under 30 inches. But still, this is a kid. I think he showed up at OU and showed some promise, and has just continued to get better and better. I thought he really had a standout season this past season with Alex Grinch as the defensive coordinator, and people didn't really want to go after him. I thought as a junior, 3 interceptions, 11 pass breakups this past season. They were throwing after everybody but Parnell Motley. And 13 pass breakups, 5 forced fumbles as well. He's got some decent ball skills. Not the best athlete in the world, I guess you could say, but a guy who I think could potentially get a chance at the next level. And so if you're looking at him in round 7, I think the Rams, need some corner help. I think he could potentially be that guy. Levante Taylor out of Florida State, another guy. Giants, I mentioned them needing corners. I think Levante Taylor could potentially be a guy that can make his way onto a roster. Josh Metellus, I mentioned 49ers. I already have them taking Khalid Hudson, that linebacker safety combo. Get another safety from Michigan and Josh Metellus, really a model of consistency there for them. Houston, getting a guy that they can line up in the slot, and Josiah Scott from Michigan State, 5'9", 185. Some people think he's actually the best prospect there for Michigan State. I wish he would have been a little bit taller, to be perfectly honest with you. I didn't realize that he was 5'9". He was actually high, really only at 5'10", so there really wasn't a huge difference. But 22 pass breakups, 6 interceptions, 5 in the past 2 seasons. And, really with Josiah Scott, ran a 4.42 40. 7th round feels a little bit, little harsh for his game. He was, one of the better prospects for Michigan State. So he's one of those guys that I think you could probably pencil him in probably in the 5th round range. But if he does fall to round number 7, I think at some point, what makes sense for me is Houston's going to need a guy to play in the slot. And I think Josiah Scott could absolutely be that guy. So we've gotten through all of the defense. We've talked about the defensive prospects. We've really taken a look at them and what that's going to look like for this year's draft. We've got one more podcast prior to the draft, and that's going to be really breaking down my final mock draft. And that final mock draft, I'll make sure we have that on the website before the draft actually begins. So we'll have all of that posted. I want to actually try to get it posted before we even go on the air with the podcast. Have everything out there for you so you'll be able to take a look at that in advance of the draft. And Joe Burrow number 1, Chase Young number 2. I think Jeffrey Okudah goes number 3, and then after that, the fun begins. And we really get into things after that. So we'll take a look at the first round. We may take a look at what I've done with day 2 and day 3 as well. Some picks that really stand out, some changes that I may have made, and some things to really keep an eye on. There's going to be a ton of trades. I'm not really trying to predict the trades when it's all said and done, but I think we could talk about where I think some of the best fits will be for some of these players. If it doesn't work out the same way for my mock draft, at least looking at where might these players, what are other fits for some of these players as well. So we'll get into that. We'll talk about that tomorrow. So I hope you've enjoyed the content. We'll do this again tomorrow. One last podcast before the draft, April 23rd through the 25th, completely virtual draft. Get to see exactly what that looks like, how that all plays out. I'll be looking forward to the 30 for 30 that ends up coming out. That'll talk all about the first ever virtual NFL draft. I'll be looking forward to seeing that as well. So we'll do this all over again tomorrow. But for now, take care, everyone. This has been Gregg Schutze for ReadyForTheDraft.com and the Ready for the Draft podcast, episode 37. Draft is right around the corner. Hope you're as excited as I am. Take care, everyone, and I am out of here.